At some point this week, you will sit down at a desk or stand at a station or drive a car, and you will give the next 8 hours of your life to someone else. You will do this tomorrow and the day after. And for roughly 90,000 hours of your total existence on this earth, almost 1/3 of your entire life, gone. And here's what almost no one stops to ask. Who decided 8 hours a day was the right amount? It's not nature, not biology, not the neutral logic of economic necessity. Someone decided it, and they decided it long before you were born. In a church, in a factory, and in the offices of people who understood something you were never supposed to figure out. A rested population is a dangerous one. This is not a video about productivity. This is a video about how work was invented, who built it, why they built it, and what they were afraid would happen if they didn't. Before the factory, before the clock, before the Monday morning alarm, human beings worked very differently from the way we work today. Medieval peasants typically worked between 120 and 150 days a year. This gave them more days of rest, celebration, and communal life that were protected by the church calendar. Pre-industrial communities worked in seasonal bursts, shaped by harvests and weather and the rhythm of the land, followed by long stretches of genuine rest. The idea that human beings have always worked this hard, that ceaseless, year-round, disciplined daily labor is the natural condition of our species, is not history. It is one of the most successful pieces of propaganda ever produced. And it was built in 3 stages by 3 successive institutions across 5 centuries. Each one added a layer the previous one could not provide alone. Together, they constructed something invisible and total, a population that polices its own exhaustion and calls it virtue. Let's take it apart. Imagine you need an entire population to work harder than they have ever worked before, voluntarily, without chains, without a soldier at every door. How do you do it? You do not threaten their body. You threaten something they cannot see, cannot verify, cannot escape, yet they strongly believe exists. You threaten their soul. In the early 16th century, a theologian named John Calvin built exactly this machine. His instrument was a doctrine called predestination, the idea that God had already decided before your birth who was saved and who was damned. Nothing you did could move you from one column to the other. No confession, no penance, no deathbed prayer. For an intensely religious population, this was psychological catastrophe, and Calvin knew it, so he offered them one narrow exit. You cannot earn salvation, but you can look for signs of it. And the most visible sign that God had favored you was worldly success, discipline, industry, the refusal to be idle. In a single move, rest became sin, idleness became damnation, and relentless, grinding, joyless work became the only evidence available to a human being that their soul was not already condemned. It did not matter whether the theology was true. What mattered was that it worked, and it did, perfectly, at scale, across generations. Max Weber, writing in The Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism in 1905, identified this as the precise moment the modern work ethic was born. Not from economic necessity, not from rational self-interest, from engineered psychological terror dressed in the language of God. People did not work harder because they needed to. They worked harder because they were terrified of what it meant about their eternal soul if they stopped. Weber's deeper insight: capitalism did not create the Protestant work ethic. The Protestant work ethic created capitalism. The moral cage was built first. The economic system simply moved in and made itself at home. By the time the Industrial Revolution arrived 2 centuries later, an entire civilization had already been convinced that to rest was to sin. The factory owners did not need to persuade anyone of anything. The church had already done it for them. Calvinist theology gave work its moral authority. But theology alone cannot extract 12 hours of daily labor from an entire population. For that, a new instrument was needed, not a machine of production, a machine of measurement. E.P. Thompson, writing in his landmark 1967 essay, Time, Work Discipline, and Industrial Capitalism, made a discovery that reframes everything we think we know about the history of labor. Before the Industrial Revolution, time itself was experienced differently. Pre-industrial workers did not think in hours. They thought in tasks. You worked until the field was plowed, until the bread was baked, until the net was mended. When the task was done, you stopped. Rest was not laziness. It was the natural completion of work. The two were inseparable. The factory destroyed this entirely. A factory owner needed bodies present for fixed, measurable, purchased periods, regardless of whether any particular task had been completed. The logic of the factory was not the logic of the field. It was the logic of the clock. And so the clock was imposed. Church bells were replaced by factory whistles. The rhythm of seasons, day and night, was replaced by the tyranny of the shift. Time, which had always been fluid, communal, and task-shaped, was suddenly a commodity, something that could be measured and purchased. Thompson's argument is precise. The clock did not measure work. It manufactured it. It took human time and converted it into units that could be owned by someone else the moment you sold your labor. But the factory owners understood something else. You cannot install a clock in an adult who has spent their entire life working by task and season. The resistance would be immediate and total. So they went earlier. The first mass public schools in industrial England were not designed to educate children. They were designed to train them, to sit still, to follow instructions, to begin when the bell rang and stop when the bell rang. The clock was installed in the human nervous system before the child was old enough to question it. By the time they entered the factory, the discipline of measured time felt natural, because it had always been there. Weber gave work its soul. Thomson's factory owners gave it its skeleton. Together, they built a human being who not only accepted the structure of industrial labor, but could no longer imagine life without it. In 1932, at the height of the Great Depression, the philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell sat down and wrote an essay that should have changed everything. It was called In Praise of Idleness, and it opened with a confession that still reads like a provocation. I think that there is far too much work done in the world, and that immense harm is caused by the belief that work is virtuous. Russell's argument was not philosophical abstraction, it was mathematics. By 1932, advances in technology and industrial productivity meant that the basic necessities of civilized life, food, shelter, clothing, infrastructure, could be produced by the entire working population in 4 hours a day. The other 4 hours produced either luxuries for those who already had everything, or kept workers too busy and too tired to develop the one thing the ruling class feared most: political consciousness. Russell observed what Weber and Thomson had each glimpsed from their own angle. The ruling class had always understood that leisure is dangerous. A rested human being reads, thinks, organizes, asks questions about the architecture of the society they live in. An exhausted one goes home, eats and sleeps, and returns the next morning without having looked up once. The perpetuation of unnecessary work, Russell argued, was not an accident of economics. It was a deliberate political strategy dressed in the language of virtue. And the most devastating part of the strategy was that the workers themselves had been convinced to enforce it, on each other, on their children, on anyone who dared to rest. Calvin had planted the seed. The factory had watered it. And by 1932, the harvest was complete. An entire civilization that equated exhaustion with dignity, rest with shame, and the consumption of a human life by labor with the highest moral calling available to an ordinary person. Russell's conclusion was simple and has never been answered. If 4 hours of daily work is sufficient to maintain civilization, and we are working 8, who is keeping the other 4 hours? And why have we agreed to let them? That question was asked in 1932. Since then, we have built computers, algorithms, and machines capable of performing the cognitive and physical labor that once required entire workforces. If 4 hours was enough in 1932, before semiconductors, before software, before artificial intelligence, the honest calculation today points to something closer to 2 hours. The technology evolved. The 8-hour cage did not, which means the cage was never about the work. Calvin made you afraid to rest. Thomson's factory owners stole the clock and installed it in your nervous system before you were old enough to object. Russell proved, nearly a century ago, with simple arithmetic, that the amount of work demanded of you was never about what civilization needed. It was about what power needed from you. The theological trap, the industrial machine, and the political strategy each arrived at the same destination by a different road. A human being who feels guilty for doing nothing, who measures their own worth in hours of productivity, and who returns to work every Monday morning not because they must, but because they have forgotten that the choice was ever theirs to make. 90,000 hours, 1/3 of your life. The question Russell asked in 1932 has never been answered. It has only been buried, under more work, more guilt, and the same quiet insistence that this is simply how things are. It isn't. It never was. Now you know who built it. The question is the same one we left you with last time. What do you do with that?